Chapter 8. Wilbur Chamus, age 38, was a veteran of the Korean War, a former resident of New York City, and now a veteran of the Los Angeles area. He was a black man, a former street hustler, and a pimp, making the big score and rising to the top, now the overseer of 20 separate drug rings in the South Central District of L.A. Drug rings that served the junior high school crowd up to the serious lifetime junkies. The man, Wilbur Chamus, better known to his friends as Slim, stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed barely 150 pounds. He wore his hair short and sported a finely manicured goatee. His dress habits were perfect, stylized double knits, leather jackets, and a vast array of expensive hats. He smoked the best Havana cigars and always sported a beautiful black woman wherever he went. To a great many young people in the depressing neighborhoods of Watts, Wilbur Chamus was a man to be admired. On the Saturday night following the hit of the Oyo house, Chamus met with 2 of his biggest drug traffickers in his office above the Paris Club, which he owned. The 2 men were Junior Willis and Elmo Zachary, black kingpins in their own right. Wilbur had called the 2 men to his office because he had been approached through Horning about the possibility of buying a large amount of heroin. Horning had come to Chamus after being approached himself by Rufus. Kenyatta's man had told the street hustler that his man had scored big and was seeking a buyer. Horning was also told that there was $5,000 involved as a finder's fee if the man would set up the buy with Chamus. Horning had agreed instantly to try. $5,000 was more money than the small-time hustler had ever seen at one time in his life. As he left Rufus that night, the plump black man chuckled to himself, remembering telling Johnny Miller only hours before about the big times coming down. They were bigger than Horning ever would have dreamed. Using his slight knowledge of Chamus's operation, Horning had been able to make contact with the big man through Junior Willis. Willis, who owned a small pawn shop as a front, had been ready to listen. After being told of the stash, Willis had gone directly to Chamus. Now the 3 men sat in the office trying to work out the possibilities of what they had learned. Wilbur Chamus spoke in a high-pitched voice, occasionally growing even higher whenever he became excited. He was excited on this Saturday night, and his voice cracked.
"If we can get this shit at a lower price than Manning delivers, we'll go,"
Chamus said. Junior Willis sat on the expensive couch and sipped at his bourbon and water. He had been listening to the same line for the last 3 hours, but he still had his doubts.
"What you mean?"
Willis said.
"Is if we know who the f***'s bringing this shit in, right, my man?"
"Man," Chamus replied,
"this can't be no setup. The pigs in this motherfucking town ain't got no access to that much ish, and if they did, no cop with his head on straight will be using it to nail some dudes."
"I could dig it," Elmo Zachary nodded. "They'd unload the ish themselves, make some fine off green."
"Right,"
Chamus said quickly.
"I think we're onto something here. Something big. Man, we got another connection besides that motherfucking white Manning. We'll be playing both sides against the middle."
Chamus laughed.
"If they're scoring that big, my man, then they heard of Wilbur Chamus. You dig where I'm coming from?"
It was always within Chamus's character to forego safety when in doubt and rationalize himself to dangerous positions. It was not that he enjoyed the danger or the uncertainty, but because he was truly conceited about himself and his position in the underworld. Willis knew it, yet he was powerless to stop him when Chamus got himself hyped.
"Okay, my man, you know where you're coming from. I can't say no more."
Willis leaned back on the couch and stared at the glass he held in his hand. Chamus knew what the man was thinking, but once again, the tall, thin black dealer refused to allow Willis's questions to penetrate. Chamus had come a long way and had traveled the rough terrain by himself. without help from outsiders. His judgment, good or bad, had brought him this far, and he wasn't about to desert it now.
Willis?
Chamus began in a low-keyed voice.
I don't know who the hell you think you're dealing with, man. But let me say something down on your damn head.
Willis remained seated on the couch, staring at his half-finished drink. He knew what was coming and was prepared for it. Chamus glared at his black hustler for a moment before beginning.
I'll tell you, Willis,
he said.
Ain't no one in this f***ing world knows anything more about my shit than myself. No one. And that includes you. You dig?
Willis nodded, then took a long swig from his drink. Chamus stood directly in front of him and stared down at the black man, hoping to garner some better response than he had. But Willis refused to budge. In a brief moment, Chamus's urge was to swipe the glass out of Willis's hand, take the smaller man by the lapels, and throw him across the room. But once again, the tall black man managed to control his temper. He knew that any action like that would only mean a tougher time down the road, and with the amount of money that was now at stake, it would be a mistake to jeopardize their future. Annie's restaurant was a small, greasy spoon diner located on Alvarado of Wilshire in downtown Los Angeles. Most of Annie's regular customers were winos, the down-and-out men of the streets. There was no racial imbalance inside the garishly lit room. Both blacks and whites were accepted. Junior Willis stood out amongst the poorly dressed men with his mohair suit, trimmed tie, and alligator shoes. His tall, lean frame seemed to dominate the small diner when he entered. Quickly, he took a seat at the counter and ordered a cup of coffee. 2 country and western tunes later, Willis was joined at the counter by Horning. The small, heavy-set black man was excited, his eyes bulging with interest as he waited for Willis's reply.
Well,
Horning asked quietly after a long silence.
You got it, my man,
Willis replied quietly.
You mean we're going with it? That's right, Horning. Just spoke with the man a few minutes ago. We set it up with equal men on both sides. No guns and a chemist that my man will supply.
Horning stared down at his coffee for a moment.
What's in it for me? You jiving me?
Willis snapped.
Man,
Horning pleaded.
We ain't got down to no talking that I can recall.
Willis sighed.
All right, my man. 2% of the sale. That's enough for you.
Horning could not control the smile that etched its way across his face. 2% of $1 million was a lot of cash. More bread than the little black man ever thought he would see.
Okay, Willis,
Horning replied.
You got yourself a deal. I'll call you as soon as I see my man.
The 2 men shook hands as Horning rose from his stool. The smaller man was happy, excited about his prospects. But as he looked into Willis's face, a sudden tremor of fear surged through him. The money sounded good, was good, but there was something else happening here that Horning could not quite grasp. As he left Willis sitting alone at the corner, Horning kept telling himself that his fears were coming from the fact that now he was dealing in the big time. And at that altitude, every man suffered. The Los Angeles night was hot and clear. Horning drove his old, beat-up Chevy through the downtown area and continued on through the city center towards Watts. He had done his job, and from now on, he hoped that he could just go back and collect his money. He would tell the tall, bald-headed supplier named Jim that the arrangements had been made and everything was ready to go. That dude, thought Horning, envisioning the massive size of the man named Jim, is one hell of a fucker. Horning had met Kenyatta just that one night, only 24 hours before, when Rufus had approached him. They had gone together to a small apartment on 54th Street, a place rented by Kenyatta just for this occasion. There, with Rufus and Edgar standing watch and Elliot Stone looking from the bedroom, Kenyatta, known to Horning as Jim, had laid it down. "We know you got motherfucking good connections in this town," Kenyatta had said, watching Horning closely. "And we intend to use them." Horning had sipped on his Jack Daniels and listened quietly as Kenyatta explained to him just how big a deal it was that was coming down. Without mentioning specifics, Kenyatta told him that all of the South Central area could be taken care of for at least 6 months with the amount of stuff in Kenyatta's possession. After explaining it all to Horning, the room had fallen into silence as the men waited for the small black man's answer.
"I think,"
Horning began slowly, feeling the tension rise in himself, "that I can help." Kenyatta smiled. His organization had known about Horning for a long time, had seen him work the streets and sometimes make a big score with one of the larger dealers. They had known that he had an inside track to Chamus. Now they were taking a chance that the little man's sources were as good as they believed. "Who is the dude?" Kenyatta asked after pouring another round. Horning laughed nervously.
"Oh man, you know I can't lay that job down on you."
"Sure, man. Okay, just set it up and we'll meet." They spoke for another hour and finally agreed to a 1% cut of the selling price. It was an unwritten law among the big dealers that the middleman got a cut from each side without divulging his take to anyone. Now, Horning was in on 3%, a healthy cut. Horning turned slowly onto 54th Street and pulled to a stop in front of the modern-looking apartment house. Palm trees swayed in the wind outside, and Horning listened as he heard the laughter of partygoers in an apartment upstairs. In his mind, he saw the day when he had money and would be able to party like the people upstairs. Throughout Horning's life, that had been his ultimate goal. A little bread, some fine women, and a whole lot of liquor. Outside of that, nothing much interested the short, plump black man. After knocking 3 times on the door, Horning waited. He heard the sound of footsteps inside, then someone coming to the door. In a moment, Rufus swung open the door.
"Hey man, what's happening?"
Rufus asked, his drawl much thicker than usual.
"Got to talk with Jim, man."
Horning said. Rufus grinned and winked at Horning as he stood aside and let the smaller man into the living room. The apartment was just the same as when Horning had seen it the night before. A sofa, 3 chairs, a small coffee table. The kitchen off to the side sported a stand-up bar, and that was about it. Horning knew that when men dealt with the kind of stash these guys did, the simpler things were the easier and safer the sale would be. Kenyatta entered the room after Horning had taken a seat on the couch. He was wearing a turtleneck and tight-fitting pants. He looked bigger than Horning had remembered, and somehow much more threatening. "Well, my man, what's jiving?" Horning took a deep breath before speaking. He looked up quickly at Rufus, leaning against the door, then back at Kenyatta.
"Jim,"
he began.
"they want a deal."
Kenyatta glanced at Rufus and smiled. "See, man? I told you this little dude was gonna come out all right. He's our man."
"Yeah, baby,"
Rufus exclaimed.
"that cat's straight."
It should have come off as a compliment to Horning, but instead, he felt a cold chill of suspicion run up his spine. Something wasn't quite right, and he was beginning to feel it. "Man," Kenyatta began again, "you gonna be one rich son of a bitch. Can you dig that, Horning?" The small black man nodded. The thought of the money had left him for a moment, but now it took a center place in his mind. He realized that all thoughts he might have, all paranoid feelings, were due to the fact that he was dealing with such high stakes. This was no street gig this time, he told himself. Kenyatta poured a drink for Horning, then for Rufus and himself. As he handed the drink to Horning, he asked,
"All right, man. What's the gig?"
"Well, Jim,"
Horning began,
"he wants a meeting. 2 of your people, 2 of his, and a chemist, some dude to analyze the shit."
"Sounds righteous," Kenyatta replied.
"Anything else, my man?"
Yeah. No guns."
"That go both ways?"
Kenyatta asked.
"Yeah, no shit, man. It's straight."
Horning took a quick sip of his drink.
"Okay. Set it up. Make the arrangements for the place and the time. We'll bring a sample, enough to analyze, then we'll talk a little bit about the business, you dig?"
Horning nodded.
"I'll get back to him tonight. Should have something happening later."
Kenyatta reached down and patted Horning on the shoulder. The little man seemed to collapse inside himself, withdraw into a shell. Kenyatta knew the man was dealing outside his league, and he also knew that if the deal was to succeed, Horning would have to have confidence.
"My man,"
Kenyatta began softly,
"you bring this thing off for us, and I'll take you in with me. We need a dude who could think, and I can see you ain't much for action. Think about it, Horning. You remember you got yourself a place here. You dig where I'm coming from?"
Horning looked up and smiled.
"Yeah, and thanks, man."
"Don't mention it, baby. We're all in the same f***ing game together."
After Horning left, Kenyatta watched him through the window.
"That little dude's gonna get himself cut real bad before this gig is through."
Elliot Stone entered the room, looking now as though he had done nothing more than fall down the porch step. He was moving well, and his old agility seemed to have returned.
"It's going down, huh?"
he asked. Kenyatta turned from the window.
"That's right. Once we get through that Horning, we're going right to the top. They're interested, and if Chamus feels that way, then the dudes he's been dealing with are gonna feel the same f***ing way."
Stone leaned against the bar and lit a cigarette.
"How you gonna get through Chamus? I mean, he's a big, mean cat with lots of local connections. Dig where it's at?"
"Yeah, I dig, Elliot. The way I see it, though, we got ourselves a couple of ways to go with this thing. A little muscle in the right place, or we tell him we got in our possession one little f***ing file. Enough to rip apart his entire organization if it was to get into the wrong hands."
"Man,"
Stone replied,
"I don't know about that. I mean, you're putting yourself awfully close to me. You know that?"
"Sure, man," Kenyatta said. "But I don't think we'll have to worry about that. Rufus here and Edgar, they both handle themselves pretty f***ing well. I think in that meeting, we'll just need a muscle, not much else." Stone nodded. He hoped that Kenyatta was right. But then again, if Chamus knew that Kenyatta had the file, Stone would be able to surface again and get in on the action himself. But that was only wishful thinking, and Stone knew it. 1 hour passed, and finally the phone call came from Horning. At 6 o'clock that morning, they were to meet with the man at Weldon's warehouse, a broken-down building on Adams Boulevard near Crenshaw. In a nervous voice, Horning explained how the signals were to work and what they were to do when they arrived. When he finished, Kenyatta complimented him on his efficiency, and Horning responded with a crisp,
"Thanks."
The kind that men utter when they know that no matter what they do, they are going to lose anyway. After hanging up the phone, Kenyatta turned to Stone and Rufus.
"Well, gentlemen,"
he said,
"break out the Jack Daniels. Looks like we're going to have one long motherfucker tonight."
Weldon's warehouse was dark at 5 minutes to 6 that morning. The street running along the south wall was empty except for an occasional wild dog roaming the gutters looking for food. The tall 2-story building stood between an empty lot on one side and a deserted factory on the other.
Rufus drove the big Cadillac slowly in front of the wooden warehouse, then turned the corner after the factory. Kenyatta sat in front, peering silently at the dark shadows and the empty terrain. Behind him, Edgar sat tensely waiting, holding a small satchel that contained 1 ounce of pure, uncut heroin. Behind the warehouse was an alleyway. Rufus pulled into the small opening and cruised slowly until he reached the rear loading dock of the warehouse. There was a white light bulb burned above the platform. When the front bumper of the Cadillac was parallel to the end of the platform, the light suddenly went out. "That's our signal, gentlemen," Kenyatta said coldly. Rufus nodded as he pulled the car to a stop just beyond the platform. "Well, let's make it in and have our visit," he said. "Remember," Kenyatta began before either Rufus or Edgar could get out the car. "Elliot and his men are just outside in front. If this is some kind of motherfucker setup, go that way."
Man,
Edgar replied.
you best believe I haven't forgotten that ish.
Kenyatta nodded, opened his door, and climbed out. He stretched his tense body in the early morning chill, but the cold was not affecting him. His adrenaline had been flowing all night, waiting for the chance to deal with Chamus. It had been a year in coming, and now he was about to break it open. Or at least he hoped he was. He knew what the danger would be inside, since no one was supposed to be carrying weapons, and he hoped that none of Chamus's men had black belts in karate. Kenyatta, Edgar, and Rufus had black belts themselves, but only a handful of men had ever seen them use it, and they were now dead. Rufus and Edgar joined Kenyatta, taking their stance on either side of the tall black man. "Okay," Kenyatta said. "You motherfuckers remember my name is Jim, dig?" Rufus chuckled. With everything that was going down, Kenyatta's biggest worry all night had been whether or not the 2 men would blow the name. The men approached the platform slowly. Suddenly, out of the shadows, appeared a tall, heavy-set black man wearing an old army jacket. "It ain't dawn yet," he said. "Yeah," Kenyatta replied, "but it's cool." The man nodded and waited as Kenyatta and his 2 men climbed the stairs and joined him on the dock. Without speaking, the heavy-set black opened a small door to the warehouse and stood aside as Kenyatta and his men walked through. Inside of the building was cold and damp. The smell of rotting wood permeated everything. Kenyatta stood in the hallway, lit only by 1 naked bulb, and waited. Rufus and Edgar were right behind him. Finally, at the other end, a medium-sized black man wearing a business suit and a huge fur coat over that approached the trio. "This way," he said simply. Kenyatta and his men followed the black down the hallway to the end, where they turned the corner and entered through the first door on the right. "Gentlemen," the black said, "welcome." Inside the small office sat Wilbur Chamus, wearing a huge coat and a felt hat. To either side of him stood the largest black men Kenyatta had ever seen. Both men wore turtlenecks and light windbreakers. Kenyatta knew instantly that they were dressed for action. The large table in the center of the room provided the neutral ground for the meeting. Chamus gestured to the chair opposite him, and Kenyatta took a seat.
How's it going, my man?
Chamus asked lightly, looking directly at Kenyatta. "Everything seems to be cooking, my man."
That's cool,
Chamus replied softly.
"Hard times we got happening, roundabouts."
Kenyatta smiled, a crooked, effortless grin that had brought fear to many a man. "You look like you're doing all right, though." Chamus laughed, a high-pitched giggle that sounded more nervous than humorous.
"That's right, Jim. A man learns who his friends are, and he makes things happen. You dig where I'm coming from?"
Kenyatta nodded. The 2 men sat facing each other for a moment longer. Chamus was attempting to size up this strange black man who had come into Los Angeles with a pound of heroin and a willingness to deal. He realized that there were many questions still not answered, but he also realized what kind of money was at stake here. He would answer those questions later. For now, the huge bald black man sitting opposite him was his key to a fortune. And Kenyatta stared into the face of Wilbur Chamus. The man seemed etched in time and place, as though he had never been a child and has always looked the way he did now. His bony face and cold eyes gave away nothing, Kenyatta decided. Nothing at all. The only way to tell if something was coming down with the man was through his voice. Kenyatta decided that he had better listen intently to the tone of Chamus's voice. It was the only way to read the man.
You want to get your head
Chamus asked after a brief silence. Edgar pulled out the small baggie of white powder from the satchel and passed behind Kenyatta with it. As he gave the heroin to Stewart, he felt all eyes in the room on him. Kenyatta watched the men across the table from him intensely. He had heard of the magic of the powder, but had never seen its effects this close at hand. Like a magical metal, the men were drawn to the stuff, worshipful of it even. Kenyatta looked from Chamus to his bodyguards and back to Chamus again. He wished that he could kill all three on the spot, but he knew that he must wait. Stewart took the small bag full of smack and walked back into the room with it. Kenyatta watched him close the door behind him, then turned back to Chamus. I know, Kenyatta said, that the little white friend in there ain't gonna do nothing stupid. Ain't worth but a couple thou on the street. You dig where I'm coming from? Chamus frowned at Kenyatta.
Man, I am the main man in Los Angeles. No way I pull anything like snatching your little bit of stash, you dig? I mean, you deal with me, baby, and you dealing with the biggest.
Right on, Kenyatta replied, amazed at the man's ego. It wasn't everyone, he thought, who would come out and admit something like that to a total stranger. Buying was one thing, but letting a dude in on your game was another. They waited for 15 minutes while the chemist tested the purity of the heroin inside the other room. Kenyatta smoked a cigarette, and Chamus busied himself with a cigar. Finally, Stewart emerged from the room. He was smiling. Kenyatta could see that the little white man never enjoyed disappointing people.
Okay, Stewart, what's happening?
Chamus asked, his voice high-pitched.
Well,
Stewart began.
The stuff is the best I've ever seen, Mr. Chamus. The very best.
Chamus looked at Stewart for a moment longer, then glanced quickly at Kenyatta.
He seems to dig your smack, Jim, baby.
Ain't no reason he shouldn't, my man, Kenyatta replied. This stuff is as good as it comes. Chamus smiled quickly. He told Stewart to leave, and the white man hurried out of the office quickly. Kenyatta wondered where little white men like Stewart went when they were finished serving black men like Chamus. Probably some little room with flowers and a television set, Kenyatta thought.
Okay, my man,
Chamus began in earnest.
We know the stuff is fine, but we ain't sure which batch this shit is from. So when we deal and make the exchange, we bring Stewart along again just to keep things honest, you dig?
Yeah, only one thing we ain't got to yet, Chamus, Kenyatta said. We ain't talked about why we're both in this motherfucking cold warehouse when we should be home in bed with a foxy lady. Man, we ain't talked money, you dig that? Chamus laughed.
Oh man, what I'm gonna offer you ain't gonna do nothing but make your head swim.
Kenyatta grinned at Chamus. Okay, my man, I'm waiting. Chamus leaned back in his chair and puffed smoothly on his cigar. The game was his, or so he thought, and no one was going to stop him now.
Jim, my man, you deliver me a pound of that ish as righteous as the shit we seen here this morning, and I'm prepared to grease your palm with a cool $1,000,000 in cash, small bills, and none marked. Can you dig that?
Kenyatta stared at Chamus coldly. The other man's eyes began to grow hazy. He had expected a little more than just a leveled stare.
What is it with you, my man?
Chamus demanded. $1 million, eh?
That's right.
Kenyatta pulled out a cigarette and lit it slowly. He took a long drag and blew the smoke across the table and into Chamus's face. Both of the black dealer's bodyguards took a threatening step forward. My man, Kenyatta began slowly. You tell me, you the big man down here, the main man. Well, a dude who can score as big as I do. Well, he knows a few things. Chamus listened in silence, now leaning forward. See, my man, Kenyatta continued. I happen to know you score outside the city and with people capable of handling what I could deliver. Tension began filling the room as Chamus ground out his cigar on the table. His anger was rising quickly. Now, Kenyatta said, since I don't know the dudes personally and you do, maybe we can work something out. You dig where I'm coming from? Chamus took a deep breath. When he spoke, his voice was pitched very high.
Man, you got to be something else. You think I...
Kenyatta cut him off. Listen, my man, you offer $1 million for this shit. Those boys you deal with, they'll go 2, maybe 3. Now, man, think. A finder's fee? That's 10%. Man, that's $200,000-300,000. And for nothing.
Nothing?
Chamus screamed.
I offer you a good deal, and now you want something else?
Kenyatta watched the man as he carried on. He knew that all Chamus was worried about was the $5-6 million profit he could make out on the streets. It was driving him crazy to think it might be slipping through his fingers. Finally, Chamus made his offer once again, this time raising the figure by $500,000. Kenyatta just laughed. Man, I don't need your motherfucking money, but I do need your contacts, and I'm willing to pay for them. Chamus stared at Kenyatta as though unable to believe what he was hearing. Finally, he sighed, then leaned back in his chair. His voice had dropped, and Kenyatta realized the man was up to something when he said,
Okay, man, let me think on it for some time. Got to talk to some people, you dig?
Sure, man, sure. I could dig something like this taking a little time, but not too much time, you dig? Kenyatta smiled at Chamus.
Yeah, I dig it, Jim.
Chamus said. He stood up and extended his hand.
Sorry, man, but I didn't see what you were driving at, you know? Sometimes a man gets a little hard in the head.
The sudden reversal was too obvious. Kenyatta shook the man's hand and wondered when the truth was going to strike. Kenyatta, Rufus, and Edgar walked out of the small office. Chamus and his 2 bodyguards were standing behind the wooden table, watching them closely. The long hallway was empty. The men who were present when Kenyatta had entered the warehouse were now gone. Kenyatta stopped midway down the hall and turned to Rufus and Edgar. You guys in the mood for a little action? He asked. Both men nodded. I think we're going to get a little outside. Kenyatta led the way. When he reached the door leading out onto the platform, he opened it slowly. The Cadillac was still where he had left it, and the alley was empty. Okay, be ready, Kenyatta said as he stepped out onto the platform. The 3 men walked down the steps and headed toward the caddy. When they were 15 feet from the car, the 2 bodyguards who had been inside the office, along with the 2 men who had greeted Kenyatta earlier, popped up from behind the car. What's happening? Kenyatta asked. The 4 black men approached Kenyatta, Rufus, and Edgar slowly. They were unarmed, but wore faces that seemed etched with the approaching violence. Kenyatta stopped in his tracks. He turned quickly back toward the platform and to Chamus standing above him, leaning against the wall. Well, some kind of shit, man, Kenyatta said. Chamus laughed.
My man, I am just trying to convince you that you should deal with me. Business tactics, you might say.
Kenyatta laughed in return. The 4 men facing his group, their fists clenched at their sides. By their stance, Kenyatta could tell that they were not martial arts fighters, but straight-ahead street punchers. As far as he was concerned, the fight was over before it began. His only problem now would be to get it over with quick enough so that he could land Chamus. He had to get the man himself. Okay, have it your way, Kenyatta said. At that moment, the bald-headed black man backed into a 3-point stance, stepped quickly between the 2 bodyguards, and took both men out with a chop and a kick. The closed fist chop struck the man to Kenyatta's left in the neck, and the sickening sound of bones being broken filled the early morning air. The man crumpled to the ground, screaming for his life. The kick got the other man directly in the balls. Kenyatta knew he had broken the man's pelvis as he felt the bone splinter beneath the heel of his boot. The man doubled over, grabbed his destroyed and rolled forward. His groans were muffled, and the black bile that formed at the corners of his mouth drooled down his chin. The moment Kenyatta had struck, Rufus and Edgar had also moved into action. Rufus took his man with a quick kick to the hip and a left-handed karate chop to the man's ribs. Later, the man would count 6 broken ribs and a dislocated hip. His services were lost the moment Rufus struck. Edgar's man had been more difficult. He had seen Kenyatta strike and had flung out at Edgar with a right, catching the thin black man across the lower jaw. Falling onto his back, Edgar raised his legs and waited for the Black Hood to jump him. The man came straight at him, and Edgar grabbed his neck between his ankles and flung him over onto his side. Jumping to his feet, Edgar took his foot and placed it on the man's Adam's apple and exerted pressure. The black man died instantly as Edgar pushed his Adam's apple to the back of his throat. As the man died, he pissed in his pants and excreted. Bile flew from his mouth like vomit, and his eyes rolled back into his head. Edgar leaned over the man's face and let go himself, allowing a flow of murky vomit to cascade down the black man's contorted face. It was a sickening sight. Kenyatta allowed the feeling of pride to swell inside his chest. As he surveyed the scene, 1 man dead, 3 crippled for life. The black leader had taught his followers well, and it was at times like these that those hours of practice paid off. The sound of the warehouse door slamming quickly brought Kenyatta out of his thoughts. Chamus, he cried, pointing to the closed door. Rufus? Edgar? Come on! The 2 men hurried up the steps. The back door to the building had been locked by the fleeing dope pusher. Kenyatta took a step back from the door, set himself, then snapped his foot out at the rotting wood with blinding speed. Door splintered into 1,000,000 pieces, leaving a gaping hole. Kenyatta reached inside, grabbed the knob, and opened the door.
He can't make it too far,
Kenyatta exclaimed as he and Edgar raced down the hallway.
Stone's out front.
Elliot Stone sat low in the front seat of the Ford, directly across the street from the warehouse. He watched the large front of the building closely, his eyes riveted mainly on the door. When he arrived 3 minutes after Kenyatta, Stone had seen the old Plymouth pull to a stop down the street and around the corner from him. The huge fins of the automobile stuck out just enough so that he knew the car was still parked. As far as he could tell, there were only 2 men inside. The order from Kenyatta was for Stone to remain parked in front of the warehouse until he saw Kenyatta's Cadillac leave. But that had been over a half hour ago that he had arrived, and the black athlete was getting fidgety. Inside the warehouse, Kenyatta and Edgar walked quietly through the darkened aisles, straining to hear some sound from the fleeing man, but they heard nothing. The old building was dark, and the only light came through the slats at the top of the building. Kenyatta knew the man was still somewhere inside the building and that he was playing a waiting game. Rufus crept up behind the two men carrying 238s, one in each hand. He gave the weapons to Kenyatta and Edgar. "Any sign?" Rufus asked in a whisper. "The dude vanished," Kenyatta replied, "but he's still in here." "Think he's armed?" Rufus asked. "No way. Would have used it outside if he was." The three men stood in the center of the huge building, each man facing a different direction. They listened and they waited. Outside, Elliot Stone peered intently at the building. He felt inside that something was wrong. Suddenly, a small door near the end of the building began to open slowly. Stone reached inside the glove compartment and pulled out his .45. He held the heavy pistol in his right hand, the barrel pointing at an angle towards the ceiling. The door opened a little farther, and a man peered out wearing a felt hat. Stone recognized him instantly. "Chamus," he said softly to himself as he gripped the .45 and pulled the hammer back. Wilbur Chamus bolted from the door, ran down the sidewalk, and turned the corner. Stone reached for the ignition key and started the engine. He never took his eyes off the tail fins of the Plymouth, still visible around the corner. As he started to pull away from the curb, Stone jammed on the brakes. Suddenly, the Plymouth began backing up. In another moment, the entire car was visible. Stone could see the head of Chamus looking around nervously from the back seat. "Damn," Stone cursed. He watched as the car backed up all the way to the opposite side of the street. Then the driver turned the wheel hard and peeled down the street towards Stone. Stone grabbed the steering wheel, pulled it with all his might to the right, waited for the approaching Plymouth, then stomped in the accelerator. The Ford stalled for a moment, then picked up and careened out into the middle of the street. The Plymouth was 10 feet away when the Ford blocked its way. The driver pulled hard to the right, but could not avoid slamming into the rear fender of the Ford. Before Chamus or his two men inside the Plymouth knew what was happening, Stone was out of his car, his .45 leveled at the three men inside.
"Kill the motherfucker!"
Chamus screamed, his voice so high it sounded like a wounded animal. Stone saw the passenger reach inside his coat. Without hesitating, he pulled the trigger on his pistol and watched in horror as the glass shattered. The black man's face disappeared in an orgy of blood and bone as the slug entered him just above the nose and between the eyes. Stone whirled and fired 1 second later at the driver. This time, the bullet entered the man's eye, and like an exploding red rose, blew out his eyeball and brains at the same moment. Chamus had disappeared inside the car. Stone held the gun at arm's length, aiming into the car. The two dead men in the front seat were plastered against the upholstery, their heads barely recognizable as human. Kenyatta heard the first crash of the cars and began racing toward the front of the warehouse. When he, Rufus, and Edgar reached the door, they heard the 2 gunshots. For a moment, Kenyatta felt sick to his stomach. His first thought was that Elliot Stone had been gunned down in the waiting car. "Shit!" Kenyatta screamed, keeping himself and his men inside.
"No sounds, man,"
Rufus said.
"It can't be Elliot."
Kenyatta knew he was right. Quickly he opened the door, and he was greeted with the sight of Stone standing like a statue, holding his gun toward the wrecked Ford. Kenyatta ran out and came up next to Stone.
"Shit, Elliot, where's Chamus?"
he demanded.
"Don't know, man,"
Elliot replied, his voice shaking with excitement.
"He was in the motherfucking car."
Kenyatta smiled to himself, raised his .38, and walked slowly around the side of the car.
He passed the front seat, then peered into the rear. There on the back seat lay Wilbur Chamus, big-time pusher of heroin to the kids, the junkies, and the whores of Watts. The man lay curled up in the seat, his knees up to his chin and his hands around his legs. He was shaking like a little child. Brain matter and blood from the two men up front were all over him, some of it on his face and lips. He had been vomiting, and his face was covered with his own vomit. "Man," Kenyatta said bitterly, "you are some kind of motherfucker." Chamus flinched, then turned and looked up at Kenyatta. The man's eyes were like marbles, large and unseeing.
"Don't shoot,"
he begged, his voice like a little girl's. "Get the f*** out," Kenyatta ordered. Chamus lay there, not moving. Kenyatta turned to Stone, who was now standing beside him. "Elliot, get the f***ing caddy and bring it around. We got to get the f*** out of here." Stone ran at full speed to the rear of the warehouse and jumped inside the car. The bodies of the 4 men lay next to it, and their stench of bile, excrement, and death hovered heavily in the alleyway. "All right, motherfucker," Kenyatta demanded when Stone had brought the car around. "Get the f*** out of there, lest you want a bullet down your shit-ass mouth." Chamus rolled off the seat, then crawled along the floor and fell out onto the pavement. Rufus and Edgar each grabbed an arm and threw the terrified man into the back seat of the Cadillac. Kenyatta got into the front with Stone and they drove off. The massacre they left behind would be found within another 10 minutes by an aged wino who had been sleeping behind some trash cans in the alley. The man, his brain rotted with the juice, would be able to do one thing for the police: identify the tall, bald-headed black man.